Welcome to the next installment in the series 10 Arguments Against Moral Objectivity and Why They Fail. In this installment, we're going to talk about something that actually happens in everyday moral discourse, especially when people are debating or disputing an important moral issue. Take, for instance, abortion. Imagine that a person's pro-life and another person's pro-choice, and they're sort of hashing out their differences and having a dispute, morally speaking. Now, at some point, they might kind of come to loggerheads and end on a conciliatory note. They might say, you have your opinion on abortion. I have my opinion on abortion. They're both our opinions. We have a right to our own opinions. Therefore, they're sort of equal importance, value, or have equal standing. What's the assumption there? Well, since everyone has a right to their own opinion, the pro-life person has a right to their opinion, the pro-choice person has a right to their opinion. One view is not necessarily better than the other. They're of equal plausibility, given that each person has a right to their own opinion on the matter. And if everyone's opinion is sort of on the same playing field, one isn't better than the other, then there is no such thing as objective moral truth, because objective moral truth implies that there's a truth of the matter, and other views that are inconsistent with that truth are false. These thoughts can all be put together in the argument from equal rights against moral objectivity. In this video, you're going to learn about that argument and you're going to learn about its weaknesses. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. If this is your first time on the channel, consider subscribing to it and clicking the bell so you don't miss any future videos. Now let's jump into the argument. It goes as follows, and here we're following Russ Shafer-Landau's book, The Fundamentals of Ethics, in laying this argument out. If everyone has an equal right to an opinion, then all opinions are equally plausible. Premise 2, everyone has an equal right to his or her moral opinions. Subconclusion 3, therefore, all moral opinions are equally plausible. Premise 4, if all moral opinions are equally plausible, then ethical objectivism is false. Conclusion 5, therefore, ethical objectivism is false. Now let's just say what premises are probably okay and we don't need to worry about them. Well, premise 4, if we sort of already discussed it, but if all moral opinions are equally plausible, then objectivism is false. Well, why is that the case? Well, if objectivism is true, then certain moral views are going to hit the mark and be correct, and certain moral views are going to miss the mark and be incorrect. So if all views are equally plausible on the same plane in terms of plausibility, then it's not the case that there are some views that are correct and other views that are incorrect. And that is what ethical objectivism implies. So if all views are on the same plane, then yes, moral objectivism is false. So we can set aside premise 4. Now, what about premise 2? Everyone has an equal right to his or her moral opinion. Well, that's true. And in fact, what actually goes along with that is something what's called freedom of conscience. That is, we all have different moral compasses, and different things will strike us as morally right and may not strike another person as morally right, but we have to live with ourselves and we have to live with our moral conscience. And so given that there's sort of a protected domain of moral conscience, then each person has an equal right to his or her moral opinions. Now, what doesn't necessarily fall out of that, according to the moral objectivists, is that means all opinions are equally plausible. But this argument says that an equal right to moral opinions implies equal plausibility of those moral opinions. So that leaves only premise 1 as the problematic premise with regard to this argument. Remember, that premise says if everyone has an equal right to an opinion, then all opinions are equally plausible. Now, from the fact that everyone has an equal right to their own opinions, it doesn't follow that all opinions are equally plausible. And to give an example of this, Russ Shafer-Landau gives an example of him and his friend were walking through a forest. They saw a tree, and Russ Shafer-Landau was certain that this tree was an ash, And his friend was certain that it wasn't ash, he knew it was a larch. Now their views were not equally plausible. One was right, namely his friend was right about what the tree actually was, even though they each had a right to their own opinion about what kind of tree they were looking at. And Russ Shafer-Landau relates this to opinions more generally, as he says, quote, "Some historical claims are true and others false, even though we each have an equal right to our historical opinions. The same can be said of our opinions concerning economics, trigonometry, basketball, strategy, or beer brewing. Most people know more than I do about each of these things, and so my views on these subjects are far less plausible than theirs. And yet, my right to hold views, the views I do, is just as strong as anyone else's." The first premise of the argument confuses two entirely separate matters: whether a person has a right to an opinion and whether that opinion has any merit. This confusion undermines premise one and with it the argument itself. End quote. So this has cast doubt on this way of arguing against ethical objectivism, but I'd be curious to hear from you. What do you think? Do you think all people have an equal right to their own opinion? Or is it the case that moral opinion and the rightness we have to that opinion is graded and can vary according with our expertise? Keep thinking ethically and living wisely. Keep living the philosophical life.